They called them monsters of steel, cities that floated on the sea, and fortresses that could move wherever war demanded. To German officers, the first glimpse of America's aircraft carriers was nothing short of a nightmare come alive. These were not ships in the traditional sense, they were entire worlds, carrying thousands of men, hundreds of planes, and the power to project destruction across oceans. For a nation that had believed battleships ruled the seas, this was a revelation that shook their confidence to its core. Imagine standing on the deck of a U-boat, peering through binoculars, and realizing your enemy had built floating airfields larger than anything you had ever conceived. The sight alone was terrifying, but the knowledge of what those carriers could unleash was worse. To Germany's finest officers, it was the beginning of a new kind of war, one they were not prepared to fight. World War II was a conflict of evolution. Every year, new weapons, new strategies, and new machines emerged to change the balance of power. But few innovations were as shocking, or as decisive, as America's aircraft carriers. For the German military, steeped in the traditions of battleships, cruisers, and submarines, the idea of a ship that carried its own air force was almost unimaginable. By the early 1940s, Germany's naval ambitions had been built on the fearsome reputation of U-boats and the prestige of surface raiders like the Bismarck. Yet, across the Atlantic, the United States was building something entirely different, colossal vessels that turned the oceans into mobile airfields. To the Americans, they were tools of survival and dominance. To the Germans, they were terrifying symbols of a war that was slipping out of their control. These floating cities did more than carry planes, they carried a new vision of warfare. They could move anywhere, strike anywhere, and sustain operations in ways Germany could never match. When German officers first saw them, they were not just stunned, they were forced to confront the collapse of everything they believed about naval supremacy. For the German Naval Command, confidence had always been rooted in tradition. Battleships and submarines were seen as the pinnacle of sea power, and in the early stages of the war, these weapons delivered devastating blows. U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant convoys and threatening Britain's lifeline. The Bismarck, for a brief moment, stood as a symbol of German naval pride, capable of striking fear into entire fleets. Yet as powerful as these machines were, they were bound by limitations. A battleship's guns could only reach as far as the horizon, and submarines, while deadly, could never control the seas on their own. Across the ocean, however, America was quietly building something that would change everything. Aircraft carriers, once considered experimental or secondary to battleships, were now being mass-produced at an industrial pace no other nation could match. While Germany struggled to repair and maintain a handful of capital ships, the United States was launching carriers by the dozen, each larger and more capable than the last. By 1942, names like Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet were carving themselves into history, proving at Coral Sea and Midway that air power from the sea could sink even the mightiest battleship. When German officers learned of these developments, they were stunned not only by the scale but by the concept itself. A ship that carried dozens, sometimes hundreds, of planes meant that the range of destruction was no longer limited to guns. Now, an aircraft carrier could launch squadrons that traveled hundreds of miles, striking targets far beyond the horizon. Naval battles would no longer be fought by ships exchanging shells across visible waters, they would be decided by aircraft that arrived from unseen skies. For Germany, this was an unsettling realization. Their entire naval doctrine had been built around a different kind of war, one where battleships and submarines reigned supreme. The most striking difference lay in sheer numbers. America's industrial might meant that not one or two, but entire fleets of carriers were being assembled. Each vessel was not simply a warship but a moving city, complete with workshops, hospitals, kitchens, and living quarters for thousands of men. To German officers who prided themselves on efficiency and precision, this mass production of colossal floating airfields was a staggering demonstration of economic power. They had no equivalent, no counter, and no hope of matching such scale. It became clear that the war at sea was no longer a contest of ship against ship, but of vision against vision. Germany's vision belonged to the past, rooted in steel and guns. America's vision belonged to the future, where aircraft would dominate the oceans just as they dominated the skies. And as reports filtered in of carrier groups sweeping across the Pacific, the realization grew in German minds: the age of battleships was dying, and the aircraft carrier was the weapon that had killed it. The first time German naval officers saw an American carrier up close, either through reconnaissance reports or in captured photographs, disbelief was their immediate reaction. These were not warships in the traditional sense. They were floating fortresses that looked more like industrial complexes set upon the sea. The flight deck alone stretched longer than 2 football fields, capable of launching and recovering aircraft at a pace that no land base could match. Beneath that deck were hangars, repair stations, ammunition stores, and fuel tanks, all carefully organized to keep squadrons of fighters and bombers in constant motion. To officers who had grown up believing in the supremacy of surface gunnery, this was more than innovation, it was an entirely new philosophy of war. In Germany's naval culture, honor and prestige were tied to the battleship. A vessel like the Tirpitz or the Bismarck was not only a tool of destruction but also a symbol of national pride. Their massive guns, thick armor, and imposing silhouettes represented centuries of tradition in European naval warfare. Yet the Americans had discarded this tradition almost entirely, choosing instead to invest in carriers, ships that seemed, to the old guard, vulnerable and fragile. But appearances were deceptive. These fragile ships carried the most powerful weapon of all, reach. Where a battleship could fire shells for 20 miles, a carrier could send aircraft 300 miles to drop torpedoes or bombs with precision. This difference in reach changed everything. Suddenly, the sea was no longer defined by the horizon but by the range of carrier-based aircraft. A German cruiser, sailing confidently in open waters, could be attacked by planes it never saw coming. A U-boat, surfacing to recharge its batteries, could find itself hunted from the air far from any coastline. To the German command, it was as if the Americans had rewritten the rules of the ocean itself. What truly unnerved German officers, however, was the way these carriers operated as part of a larger system. Rarely did they travel alone. Instead, they formed carrier task forces, entire fleets built around protecting and maximizing the striking power of the carrier. Battleships and cruisers, once the pride of every navy, were reduced to supporting roles, guarding the carriers that had now become the true queens of the sea. Destroyers and escorts formed protective rings, radar systems watched the skies, and aircraft flew constant patrols to shield the fleet from surprise attack. The coordination required to manage such an armada was staggering, yet the Americans made it routine. To German officers, who struggled to coordinate operations even within the Atlantic due to limited resources, this level of organization was awe-inspiring. The carrier fleet was not just a display of engineering but of discipline, communication, and doctrine. It represented the full marriage of industry and strategy, a reflection of America's ability to mobilize not just soldiers, but an entire nation. And as they studied these carrier groups, the Germans came to a sobering conclusion: they were witnessing the future of naval warfare, and Germany had no place in it. To truly grasp the shock of German officers, one must understand what life aboard an American aircraft carrier looked like. These were not simply warships armed with planes, they were entire societies floating in the middle of the ocean. With crews often exceeding 3,000 men, a carrier was more like a small city than a vessel. Inside its steel walls, sailors ate, slept, worked, and even found moments of entertainment, all while sailing thousands of miles from home. The scale of the operation was staggering. Kitchens worked around the clock, producing thousands of meals a day to keep the crew fed. Medical bays, fully staffed with doctors and nurses, rivaled small hospitals, capable of performing surgeries at sea. Chapels provided places of worship, while barber shops kept men groomed. On long deployments, carriers even had movie nights and musical performances to maintain morale. For men who might spend months away from land, these comforts mattered. To the Germans, whose U-boat crews lived in cramped, suffocating conditions, the idea of such amenities was almost unthinkable. Beyond the comforts, there was the sheer efficiency. Every sailor aboard a carrier had a specific job, whether loading bombs, repairing engines, guiding aircraft, or standing watch on deck. Aircraft could be fueled, armed, and launched in minutes, creating a constant cycle of attack and return. Below deck, teams worked tirelessly to repair battle damage, keeping the ship operational even under fire. Unlike the solitary operations of German battleships or submarines, carriers functioned as living machines, where every man was a cog in a system designed for relentless war. Perhaps the most shocking element to German officers was the ability of these ships to remain at sea indefinitely. Thanks to America's mastery of logistics, carriers could be refueled, resupplied, and even repaired while still at sea. Fleet oilers transferred fuel, supply ships delivered ammunition and food, and repair ships handled maintenance, all coordinated in the vast emptiness of the Pacific and Atlantic. This meant that carriers were not tied to bases or ports in the same way German ships were. They could move anywhere, strike anywhere, and remain a constant threat. This level of endurance magnified their power. To the Germans, naval strategy had always been limited by distance. U-boats had to return to bases in France or Norway, while surface raiders needed friendly ports for resupply. But the Americans had effectively turned the ocean itself into their base. Their carriers were self-sustaining, supported by an endless chain of supply ships that stretched back to the American mainland. It was a demonstration not only of technological might but also of industrial supremacy, a system Germany could never replicate. In this way, American carriers were more than weapons, they were symbols of a nation's ability to harness its economy, industry, and manpower into a single, unified force. To German officers, watching reports of these floating cities, the realization was devastating. They were no longer fighting just a navy, they were fighting the full weight of an empire at sea. If the size and scale of American carriers stunned German officers, what truly terrified them was the striking power these vessels carried within. Each carrier was home to an entire air wing, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, all trained to launch in waves that overwhelmed any defense. For Germany, which relied heavily on the U-boat and the occasional battleship raid, the thought of facing such mobile air forces was daunting. These were not defensive ships. They were predators, designed to hunt across oceans. The aircraft themselves were symbols of American ingenuity. Fighters like the F-6F Hellcat dominated the skies, shredding enemy aircraft with their speed and firepower. Dive bombers like the Dauntless, tested in the crucible of Midway, proved devastating against surface ships, striking with precision that artillery could never match. And torpedo planes, flying low and fast, threatened even the most heavily armored vessels. Together, they created a balance of power that no German warship could withstand. A battleship like the Tirpitz might have bristled with guns, but those guns could not stop a swarm of aircraft attacking from multiple directions at once. The concept of concentrated air power at sea was something Germany never mastered. Their few attempts at carriers, such as the unfinished Graf Zeppelin, remained stuck in dry dock, more a symbol of ambition than a weapon of war. American carriers, meanwhile, operated in groups, each with dozens of aircraft ready to launch at a moment's notice. The sky above a carrier task force could fill with planes in minutes, transforming the battlefield in ways German naval doctrine could not predict. For German officers, reports of these air assaults were chilling. Convoys once considered safe under the watch of destroyers could be obliterated by squadrons of carrier-based planes. Submarines that surfaced in the mid-Atlantic to strike vulnerable shipping lanes suddenly found themselves hunted from the sky, far from any land-based airfield. The carriers had extended the reach of American power to every corner of the ocean. What made the threat worse was the rhythm of operations. Unlike land-based airfields, carriers could reposition overnight, appearing where they were least expected. One day a German convoy might feel secure under cloudy skies, only to be ambushed the next morning by aircraft that seemed to come from nowhere. For commanders who relied on careful planning and predictable patterns, this unpredictability was maddening. The Americans had turned the seas into a chessboard, moving their carriers like queens, powerful, versatile, and able to strike from any direction. The psychological impact was immense. German officers understood that their fleets were vulnerable in ways they had never been before. The might of battleships, the pride of centuries of naval tradition, had been reduced to targets. To face an aircraft carrier was not merely to face a ship, but to face an entire aerial army. It was a transformation so profound that even the most seasoned commanders could only admit in private, the balance of power at sea had shifted forever. The shock of America's carriers was not just recorded in naval reports, it seeped into the diaries and testimonies of German officers themselves. These men, often hardened by years of service and indoctrinated with the idea of German superiority, found themselves confronted with a reality that shook their convictions. In quiet entries and after-action reflections, they revealed their awe, their disbelief, and their growing sense of dread. One U-boat commander described the first time his crew spotted a carrier in the Atlantic. Through his periscope, he expected to see a standard convoy, tankers, cargo ships, perhaps a destroyer or two. Instead, he saw what he called a moving island. Its deck seemed endless, its size so massive that he could scarcely believe it floated. It was as if a city block had come to sea, he wrote. And it was guarded as though it were the heart of America itself. He knew immediately that his submarine stood no chance against such a force. His only thought was escape. Surface officers felt the same. Reports from German cruisers encountering American task forces spoke of helplessness in the face of carrier aircraft. Gun crews stood ready, their barrels trained on the horizon, but the enemy came from above, beyond sight until it was too late. One officer bitterly noted that it was like trying to fight the sky itself. Another confessed that he had underestimated America's naval strategy, believing the U.S. incapable of fielding such power so far from its shores. The reality, he admitted, was that Germany had miscalculated both American industry and imagination. Even those in Berlin, far from the ocean, could not ignore the implications. Admirals studying photographs of American carrier groups admitted privately that they had no effective counter. The unfinished Graf Zeppelin was a ghost project, a symbol of what might have been had Germany invested earlier in naval aviation. Instead, they were left with an obsolete fleet strategy, outpaced by a rival who had embraced the future. To officers who had been raised on the legends of Bismarck and Tirpitz, this was a bitter humiliation. But the most telling accounts came not in moments of battle, but in the fear of anticipation. German sailors spoke of the constant anxiety that carriers could be anywhere. A U-boat surfacing in the middle of the Atlantic no longer feared only destroyers, it feared the sudden scream of aircraft engines overhead. Convoy escorts were no longer just a handful of ships, they might hide the presence of a carrier task force waiting to unleash devastation. For men who had once believed the ocean itself offered protection, this invisible reach was terrifying. Carriers became, in the minds of German officers, more than ships. They were symbols of inevitability, proof that the war was slipping out of their hands. Every sighting, every rumor, every whisper of a carrier group reinforced the same conclusion: Germany had no answer. And in war, to face an enemy without an answer is to face defeat. By the middle years of the war, the presence of American aircraft carriers had shifted the entire balance of naval power. No longer were battles decided by the thunder of heavy guns or the clash of surface fleets, instead, they were determined by air wings launched from the decks of these colossal ships. Wherever the United States sent its carriers, control of the sea followed. For German officers analyzing these developments, the conclusion was inescapable: the age of the battleship was over. The sinking of the Bismarck had already hinted at this reality. Although aircraft had not delivered the final blow, it was carrier-based planes from the British Ark Royal that crippled the mighty vessel, proving that even the most powerful battleship could be humbled by air power. For Germany, this should have been a warning. But as America entered the war in full force, the lesson became undeniable. At Midway, American carriers destroyed 4 Japanese carriers in a single battle, halting Japan's expansion and showcasing the decisive impact of sea-based aviation. German observers, studying the aftermath, realized that if such a blow could devastate Japan, it could just as easily have crushed their own navy. Carriers also reshaped the logistics of war. They allowed America to project force anywhere on the globe, supporting invasions, protecting supply lines, and striking enemy bases far beyond the reach of conventional ships. In North Africa, carriers provided the air cover needed for Allied landings. In the Atlantic, they escorted convoys, reducing U-boat kills and ensuring supplies reached Britain. In the Pacific, they spearheaded the island-hopping campaign, bringing American forces ever closer to Japan's shores. Each of these operations underscored the same point: carriers were not just ships, they were mobile strategies, capable of redefining entire theaters of war. For Germany, already stretched thin by the demands of the Eastern Front and limited naval resources, the rise of carriers was a nightmare. They had no comparable fleet, no industrial base to construct one, and no doctrine to employ such ships effectively. The unfinished Graf Zeppelin, abandoned in a shipyard, stood as a monument to missed opportunity and flawed priorities. German officers who studied the carrier war could only shake their heads at what might have been had their nation embraced innovation sooner. Worse still, carriers exposed the fragility of Germany's naval ambitions. Every time the Kriegsmarine attempted to send a surface raider into the Atlantic, the threat of American carrier groups loomed over the horizon. Every U-boat campaign became riskier, as convoys increasingly sailed under the protection of carrier-based aircraft. What had once been an ocean of opportunity for German naval warfare had turned into a killing ground patrolled by American air power. In this way, American carriers were more than weapons, they were instruments of inevitability. They represented not only technological superiority but also the overwhelming industrial might of the United States. For German officers, watching this shift unfold was like witnessing the slow collapse of their own strategies. The sea, once a battlefield they believed they could contest, now belonged to the carriers. By the war's end, the verdict was undeniable. The aircraft carrier had not only redefined naval combat, it had rendered the old doctrines obsolete. Battleships, once the ultimate symbols of power, had become relics, hulking monuments to a vanished age. For German officers, who had spent their careers worshipping steel and artillery, this was a bitter truth. The very foundations of their naval pride had been shattered, not by ships of greater size, but by vessels that carried the skies with them. What made the realization even more painful was the simplicity of the lesson: adaptability had triumphed over tradition. The United States had dared to embrace a new way of fighting, and in doing so, had seized control of the seas. Germany, clinging to outdated visions of naval power, had been left behind. The result was not just defeat, but irrelevance. Yet there was also a haunting fascination in these reflections. Many German officers admitted, often years later, that they had been awed as much as terrified. The carriers were not only instruments of destruction, they were marvels of engineering, discipline, and imagination. In their presence, German naval strategy seemed provincial, trapped in the past, while America's fleets looked like visions of the future. And so, in their private writings and their post-war testimonies, German officers acknowledged what they could never admit during the conflict, that the carriers symbolized more than American strength. They symbolized the collapse of German dominance at sea, and the dawn of a new era in warfare. To see them was to see the inevitable, the future bearing down like a shadow across the ocean, unstoppable and absolute. History often remembers victories in terms of battles won, ships sunk, and territory claimed. Yet sometimes, the true victory lies in the moment one side realizes it can no longer compete. For German officers, that moment came when they faced America's aircraft carriers, floating cities of war that redefined everything they thought they knew about the seas. To the Americans, these carriers were not just ships but lifelines, tools of survival and dominance that carried them across oceans and into history. To the Germans, they were omens of defeat, unstoppable giants that erased the old world of naval power and replaced it with something new. And perhaps that is the enduring lesson: wars are not only fought with weapons, but with ideas. The side that embraces the future wins it. The side that clings to the past loses it. The aircraft carrier proved this beyond any doubt.